Welcome to Convergences, a political theory show from Zero Books at the intersection of emancipation and critical imagination. Today, myself and Will from Acid Horizon, as well as Corey from the Buddies of Our Organs and the K-Files, are going to be talking to writer and co-host of the Death Sentence podcast, Gareth Watkins. We're going to be reading his article and talking about its central question, which is, what happened to the revolutionary communal spirit? It's up now on the website Mental Health, and of course that's health with two L's, which is quite fitting as capital and its poison cures continue to keep us spiralling into the void of alienation. So we're going to be talking about the politics of mental illness, structural and individual explanations, and their political efficacy. And of course, we're also going to be engaging with a classic of insurrectionary thought, one that scared the shit out of everyone from Glenn Beck to the French government. What's it called? Well, I'll let Glenn tell you.
It is called The Coming Insurrection.
That's right, folks. We're going to be talking about the coming insurrection from 2007 and the dangerous politics of communal radical friendship. Gareth, welcome to Convergences.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Okay, so I'm not going to do these traditional sort of intro question of why did you feel the need to write this article? Yeah, we know things are bad. We know things are bad. Not to go into a whole network speech. The food is bad. The air is bad. The world is bad. You know, the experience of real life becomes synonymous with the overbearing presence of tension and destitution, which only accelerates insofar as it gets more intense in its own struggle against the very future. It's how we frame it. So what was the sort of impasse in how we frame mental health, the impulse to write this piece?
Well, I actually did have something that caused me to write this particular article, which was in Mental Health. A little while before, there was an article called There's No Moral Imperative to Be Miserable by James Greig, who's an absolutely brilliant writer from Scotland. So in that, he talks about the attitude and aesthetic we've all seen, mostly online, maybe in real life too, where people on the left seem to believe that it's their moral duty to be miserable because the world is bad, therefore we must also be bad. Our lives must be bad in order to properly reflect that. And it would be selling out and insufficiently empathetic to the people in the world who have terrible lives if we aren't feeling miserable ourselves. And people will couch that in the ideas of, say, Mark Fisher, who was brilliant on the links between capitalism and mental health. And through this really shallow reading of his work, and the previous people have talked about this idea, they'll come to this really defeatist position where we can't really do anything. We simply must be miserable and be online all the time. So that was James's one. People really should read it. It's excellent, and you kind of need it as a part one to my own one. So because I'm not a trained philosopher, when I see problems like the catch-22 situation where everyone is miserable, we need capitalism to go away in order to stop being miserable, but we'll never do that while capitalism is here. How do you throw a brick through the window of a bank if you can't get out of bed? Because I'm not a trained philosopher, I tried to find a solution for that. And because I was relatively young and inexperienced when I first read Coming Insurrection, that kind of stuck with me because it kind of hit me at the point where, like most of the left at the time, I was going from this anti-globalization, anti-capitalist mode that was common in the 90s to 2000s to the 2010s to actually going back and thinking about, this Karl Marx guy had some clever ideas, because people had basically split entirely from communism and socialism during that time. There's a whole ton of reasons for that are way too complex to get into right now. But Coming Insurrection hit at the sort of the end, just before Occupy and just before the California student protests, which were kind of big influence from Coming Insurrection. So this idea of, hey, what if instead of being miserable on our own in our apartments, which I can see you guys are all in your alone in your apartments, just like me, with our big stacks of books. Instead of doing that, the Invisible Committee, whoever he or she or they are, propose to come together in these communes, which are slightly different from what most people would consider to be communes, and from there start the revolution now in our own lives. Because I'm not 17 anymore, that I can see a fair few issues with that idea. I couldn't really go into the full critique and really go into that in this article because, got to hit a 2,500 word limit. So there's a lot about what the Invisible Committee said and what communization theory is, and a whole lot that I could talk about for a while. But that core of the idea was, if we can all get together, maybe we can start healing ourselves to the point where we can actually start bothering capitalism in the way we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to pick up on one of your earlier points about the reception of Mark Fisher, I always think Mark Fisher's been dominantly received in many ways only in his most sort of gothic moments, where he talks about, the reflexive impotence of, it's bad and you can't do anything about it, so to speak. And that relationship of political and social sort of change and revolution to time, it's always, there's this return to this Marxist mode of thinking, or even Leninist mode of thinking after the collapses of something like Occupy. As you said in the article, this very much Occupy, David Graeber kind of Heart and Negri Empire kind of thing, which all have these Marxist moments, but they were definitely part of a particular kind of theoretical milieu. And I guess we can get into the problems of milieus if we talk about the coming insurrection, but there's that tension between, do we have to wait for the right moments? Do we have to build something first? But how do we build anything if we can't even get out of bed? And the system's obviously accelerating, not in terms of how this accelerationist tendency, the accelerationist positivism of the 90s is less about, it's the only thing it's accelerating itself be a sort of slow cancellation of the future. I really appreciate the focus on this particular turn from communization theory. I'll just read out the quote. A revolution is only communist if it changes all social relationships into communist relationships. And this can only be done if the process starts in the very early days of the revolutionary upheaval. Yeah, very much a daring, very much enthusiastic, I think, as you said, the piece, like a convert zeal of, we can do it now. Some of the writers eventually had a book called Now.
Yeah, and it is important to point out that communization theory is quite broad. It arrived in the 70s, and the particular strain that the Invisible Committee have is not representative of the whole thing. If you go to a place like EndNotes, where they have a very academic turn of it, they don't want people forming squats and throwing bricks at the police. They want people thinking, theorizing. For the time that comes when the revolution happens, have some sort of rupture. They're a bit vague on what that will be. And then we will start communizing. They don't want people doing it right now as the Invisible Committee. And they've got a whole article in EndNotes, I forget the name right now, in basically ripping the Invisible Committee and coming insurrection to shreds. They are very against this idea, more or less because it's so cringy a lot of the time. And it is very much of its time, and it's very teenage. So it's not entirely that the coming insurrection represents this entire strain of thought. There's more out there, but without having to do a survey of every leftist in the world, I think this kind of thing appeals to most people because it's very easy. You can sum it up as be the change you want to see in the world. And so I think it's had a lot more influence than the more academic strains of things, at least in the English-speaking world.
Absolutely. I mean, just for listeners, for a good summation of a lot of communization movements, Ben Noy's Communization, Its Discontents is a really good book for that. But in terms of the Invisible Committee's mode of thinking, it's very much, this particular kind of Agambenian, arguably or ambiguously anarchist, particular strains of Italian and French thought coming out of autonomia. But one of the most interesting things about how you apply it in this text is the fundamental unit of the commune. So what was it you saw in the communes, the very plasticity of the commune, the fact that we don't have to wait for necessarily this grand workers' revolt to create a Soviet, but we can form communized or communal relations as an antidote to the very kinds of ways we're doing interpersonal relations as such. Well, I think one of the ways that this seems to be quite cringe in some circles is in many ways it's a politics of just straight up, it's not that friendship is magic, it's that anything friendship's insurrectionary and possibly even quite dialectical. Yeah,
I mean, essentially friendship is the building blocks of the revolution. You start with your friends, you build from there, and eventually we'll have the great revolution where we storm the barricades, hand in hand with our bros, our homies. Yeah, it is cringe. Yeah, it has that earnestness that you find in a lot of continental European thought, especially in anarchist thought. It doesn't have that cool academic Marxist thing to it that has become the dominant affect now. Whereas back in 2008 and that sort of days, you would have these very all power to the communes kind of affects. The whole idea of friendship as a fundamental unit of revolution, I think it fits in neatly with the Mark Fisher and earlier people talking about the psychological effects of capitalism. Most people nowadays have very few friends. We've seen even like liberal things like the study Bowling Alone, which is quite a big book back in the, I think it was early 2000s, about how people's close friendships have just declined and declined and declined. That didn't go too much into. One of the reasons was breaking down of workers, breaking down of unions, and not having a workers' club to go to after your shift. You just go home, you put on Netflix, you talk to your imaginary internet friends. And having the coming insurrection, even before the idea of imaginary internet friends was ubiquitous, it kicked back against that and it said, okay, find other people around you, not on the internet, but people you can touch, and go squat into a squat with them. I don't particularly advocate squatting. I think you can just have a bunch of people hanging out together. That's fine. And that will start repairing some of the damage that's been done by this constant isolation that we're in during capitalism, well, because of capitalism. And that gives us a platform on which we can then start building. I've tried to be as non-prescriptive as possible because the coming insurrection, as you can tell, is very prescriptive at times. And in other ways, it doesn't do nearly enough to prescribe. It's incredibly vague. But the simple idea, even if you completely ignore politics, the left, capitalism, anything, is you and 3 or 4 other people could get together and decide to help each other rather than just be friends, as in people who hang out at the bar sometimes or play D&D together. What if you said, okay, me and my D&D group are going to make each other's lives better starting today. One for all for one. And we're just going to fix everything. You could do that within capitalism. Fascists could do that if they wanted. They may even do that. But this has a particular use within the left and hopefully within furthering the goals of the left.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of stuff written about this, right? There were the 2 really well-known collection of works called Friendship as a Form of Life, right? And this includes interviews with figures like Michel Foucault, lectures delivered by Giorgio Agamben. But I want to talk about this like assertion that because of the tenor of the coming insurrection, it sort of gets labeled as either adolescent or sophomoric even. I think my knee-jerk reaction is to like pithily say like, God forbid anything possess any intensity, right? There seems to be this sort of absolute allergy to any sort of commitment that is not backed up with, 45 citations, a professor very comfortably living somewhere in England, right? Like, and for me, part of what makes the Invisible Committee so interesting is that what they are describing is, I think, in many ways, an ethos that lurks in all of history in different formations, right? It's not a transhistorical thing, right? But what the Invisible Committee, I think, contributes to is an entire history of, whether it be individuals, groups, whatever, constituting a way of conducting oneself that is absolutely incompatible with the axioms of the present, but absolutely possible for them. And I think in some ways your article taps into this sort of really well, precisely because it nails down on this concept of friendship and togetherness that I actually don't think is all that cringy. Right. I actually think that the way in which we discuss friendship is entirely foreign to the historical concept.
Of course, yeah.
In the 80s, what were the French philosophers dealing with? Foucault was writing about Galen and friendship. Derrida wrote, a famous text on the notion. And I think actually and of course there's the Schmittian stuff too, as an aside. But I think that in fact what makes the coming insurrection such a fascinating book is precisely how it intervenes in all of these converging discourses, right? You've got conventional academic, semi-anthropological anarchism coming from Graeber, and then you have what will become the endnotes folks coming in with revived interpretations of value theory, Kamat and all of the folks like that. And the coming insurrection attempts to provoke, and it situates itself on an entirely different linguistic register. It is not speaking the language of Deleuze, though it's very clearly inspired by it. It is not speaking the language of Debord or Foucault, yet the spectacle and biopolitics remain absolutely essential to them. And I think for that reason, in some ways, the Invisible Committee takes the theory they read far more seriously than many of the theorists we all, admire, or some of us who are, students kind of sickly aspire to be. In some ways, there's a seriousness in the text that is fundamentally lacking in the provocations of, 10 years later.
Yeah, it reminds me of something Foucault said in an interview about the way he writes, which is you're supposed to write in a certain way when you're an important French theorist. So he intentionally made himself sound more like Derrida and so on. He intentionally made the language more obscure, and he made it just more difficult to engage with, just to sound like what a French theorist is supposed to sound like. Yeah, the Invisible Committee, whoever they are, did dispense with all of that. Even more so in sort of their previous work, the 2 volumes of Tikkun, which was kind of came before it and kind of prefigured it in a lot of ways. That was a very idiosyncratic, strange piece of work. There was kind of its own sort of glossary of terms that it would use, like blooms and young girls and stuff that you wouldn't find anywhere else. It was because it was created by basically a bunch of kids, 21-year-olds who had just come out of university and were trying to figure things out. So they sound utterly unlike anything that's come before. And it's basically punk. It does what punk rock music does, but in a sphere of theory. You can critique punk rock for being unsophisticated, for being, again, too earnest. But like you say, you can't critique it on its authenticity. And this is ultimately very authentic in a way that's, we're probably not going to get in very many other works, especially now when the based cringe dialectic has just rules our minds and as I say in the piece, has kind of changed the left into a youth subculture rather than something that's going to actually change the world. And just like in a youth subculture, you have gatekeeping. You have people who are not cool, therefore they don't get to be in the club, and they get kicked out. They haven't read enough theory, so they're in the same way you haven't listened to enough 7-inch black metal releases to be a true metalhead. And that is, I'd say, 100% true. And it's when people read this, they will either, just as when they first hear punk rock, they will either get it or they won't get it. I got it when I was a kid. I get it less now, but I'm thinking that's just being jaded, maybe. Who knows?
I was glad that you mentioned refused in the essay, because they were a big thing for me when I discovered them. Like
Same.
In 99 or 2000. So either way, soon after they broke up, and like just all the anti-capitalist bangers on The Shape of Punk to Come.
Yeah, that was a brilliant
away.
record. Yeah, still holds up today. Very few records can touch it. And again, that was a very super earnest, wasn't it? I mean, they were pretty funny at times, but they were a very earnest, heart on their sleeve kind of band. Same with another band I mentioned, is Atari Teenage Riot, who apparently never heard of a joke. They're doing NFTs nowadays, by the way. Yeah.
I mean, the problem with Euronymous from Mayhem, the infamous godfather of the black metal scene in Norway, I mean, he used to claim to be a communist, but the more I think about it, he probably was, because he was this very much hyper internal theory-oriented kind of gatekeeper, where he was in the central committee of the base of his record store, or he wasn't. I mean, it was a commune of sorts, but this is why I'm more of a liturgy fan these days. I quite like the sort of the open post-capitalist communization of heaven that happens in that sort of area. But let's talk about the social commune a bit more. I mean, I really love the quote from the Coming Insurrection. Communes come into being when people find each other, get on with each other, decide on a common path. The commune is perhaps what gets decided at the very moment when we would normally part ways. And the sincerity there is, if we're going to have revolutions, we should at least like some of the people we're working with. And it's an effective thing in terms of cultivating affects and also disrupting the very reproductive labor that is tacit in friendship now as a kind of a social institution. I mean, you talked about how that, in many ways we're just reproducing ourselves through friendship. The idea of a friend is someone you see at the pub every week. If you get out all the excess stuff, you complain about your job, what your day, you catch up, see what's going on. What new thing are we all enjoying now in the culture sphere? But it's a refueling stop. It's a pit stop. There's a great corroboration of this in the book itself. Any observation that leaves us indifferent, doesn't affect us, doesn't commit us to anything, no longer deserves the name truth. There's a truth beneath every gesture, every practice, every relationship, and every situation. We usually just avoid it, manage it, which produces the madness of so many in our era. The very kind of mode of friendship has become, not in the sort of cynical sort of way of your capitalized sense of transactional, but no, it's actually a kind of tacit reproductive labor. I'm not going to say the words emotional labor because I don't know the theory behind it enough. There's like an autonomy or a Federici take on the reproductive labor of friendship under capital.
They're very consciously using Alain Badiou's ideas of truth in the event. How, I'm going to utterly butcher some very good and very subtle theory here, but essentially there are these events in both history and in our lives. Say when punk rock arrives, and now everything can be said to be either pre or post-punk. Or in our lives, we'll meet someone amazing, meet our first love, and then everything changes forever, and your life is now before and after of that single event in our lives. And yeah, it's again a very sincere, very heart on sleeve way of looking at things, that perhaps when we go out for drinks with the guys at our office who we normally just talk to over emails, what if after that, as they say, we decide to unionize our office? We say, you know what, we're all sick of this bullshit. Let's actually work together and let's make our lives significantly better from this second on. Yeah, it's a very nice, it's a very beautiful idea. Like, I wish there was more of that in my life. I think most people do, and I think if we got rid of a lot of our cynicism that leads to the base cringe dialectic, it would open a way for a lot more of these events with capital E, as Badiou would term them, and would probably then lead on to the formation of communes. We may not call them that. They may just be our friends. But in the way that the Invisible Committee would define them, that would be a commune just as much as the Paris Commune was, just be smaller.
I think like one thing that's really interesting that Tikkun and the Invisible Committee seem to take from Foucault and Giorgio Agamben is this idea of rendering inoperable and neutralization, right? One of the things that is central to the Invisible Committee, both in the coming insurrection and in now, in their model of destitution, is creating spaces and modes of like being together. And I know that sounds like highfalutin and like ethereal and whatever, and in some ways it sometimes is, but forms of social being and presence that render like police apparatuses unnecessary. One of the very simple rules that the Invisible Committee give you is handle things among yourselves, right? Stop turning the very things that separate you into the things that separate you and make you demarcated, subjectivated individuals, right? And in some ways this sounds silly, but in other ways it's utterly compelling to like people who wouldn't otherwise think that like the day-to-day activities, the everyday life of the capitalist subject is one that constantly strengthens these institutions. Like taking care of one another is, in this framework, a fundamentally revolutionary act. And then, of course, like the tired and increasingly sour Marxist says, well, how do you scale this, right? These are other questions, but the fundamental ones for the coming insurrection, which I think has to be understood through its provocation and not through any other framework, is, like you've been saying, it manifests in all sorts of different ways. It's there with us, even in your silly D&D group. That possibility, that latent virtual solidarity is there. It's a question of whether or not you heed the call, which is another famous Tikkun text, right? The call is aimed for those who will hear it, right?
Yeah, and I was just thinking that it kind of relates to, or it could relate to, the share housing that so many of us kind of are forced into by economic realities, that I'm like, so often the like share house kind of becomes a battleground. You know, you live with people that you're forced to live with rather than, you know, like friends or comrades. So like, how simple might it be to reimagine the share house as a commune, to actually like, yeah, you know, not just suffer through your housemates, but see like, how can we make each other's lives better? Because like, we're in this assemblage for a reason, and, you know, it's going to improve our lives. Like, just, you know, if it's only going to improve our lives financially, being able to share certain burdens, how else can it like improve our lives? This commune, this friendship, this, you know, this group that we've been forced into.
Yeah, precisely. In the original draft of the article, I talked about shared houses and things like that a lot more. That kind of got cut quite significantly in the second draft. But it turns out my editor, P. Moskowitz, had actually written a piece about their experience in a queer shared house. And I could probably send you guys a link to that to put in the show notes. But this just turned up when I was researching this, that my editor had kind of experienced the same things I was talking about here. That was the kind of model I had in my head of how this would work in quote unquote real life. Because the Invisible Committees model is basically punk houses and squats. It's for a certain kind of person, probably a young person, generally probably a white person as well. And it's for people like them who, I mean, in real life, the Invisible Committee are probably a group of French people called the Tarnac Nine, who were arrested for quote-unquote terrorism. There was like a very minor vandalism of a train station. But prior to that, they all lived together on a farm in a tiny little village called Tarnac in south of France. They obviously didn't have jobs. They just lived communally, very much like what a lot of people did in the 1960s, you know, dropping out, going live in the countryside. But they, being more intellectual and being like former Tikkun people, also got very active in their own community. They built like food banks. They would drive old people to hospitals. They set up a cinema for people. The village loved them. They turned this tiny little village around, and the people in the village were very opposed when the entire French police state just dropped in on them one day and decided that they were a terrorist group that needed like an entire SWAT team to come kick down their doors. Yeah, that's that model of just, we can just all live together, we can support each other, we can help each other get a better job. I know that doesn't sound like the most radical or most communist thing in the world, but honestly, as I've gotten older, the big thing for my mental health is I've gotten a better job that gives me more money and is less demeaning. And I'm able to do things like write articles about mental health and communism instead of lying in bed watching Naruto for literally like 18 hours a day, sometimes for most of the year at one point in my life. Just that idea of one for all for one, as opposed to everyone goes into their bedroom when they come back from their job. Everyone has their place on the chore rota, but otherwise you're doing this out of convenience because it's cheaper to be in a shared house than it is to rent your own. It's got potential. It probably won't work out for everyone, but it's got more potential than what we're doing.
Absolutely. It's weird because the model of people like the Tarnac Nine and the Invisible Committee both seems very earnest and almost utopian. At the same time, it almost feels at the same time very practical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I know some communist organizations not too far from me, and yet rather than selling the reading group model of Marxist-Leninist organization, they tend to show up to other local campaigns in things that are actually happening in their local area, you know, closing down community centers, anti-raids, police watches, and they're kind of doing the same thing. Essentially, it's a bunch of friends who, joined by a shared love of similar books, who show up and say, well, how can we help? It's like a return to almost the early sort of Christian communities actually showing up and at least nursing the sick and all of those early sort of desert father sort of communities and the like. Both seems this is cringe, this is earnestness, you know, but this is actually the Gramscian walking up to the people, not going down to them or going out to them, but walking up to them and saying, I'm here from the commune and how can I help? And if we have a similar sort of reverberation of an affect, maybe this can proliferate and we can do it now. Even if you want to read this in a cynical way, this earnestness is still a kind of advertisement. Like, you think a better future is possible? Then we'll eat these tiny things, not to go all Gandalf and say little acts of kindness to keep the capitalism at bay sort of thing. But there is a kind of earnestness which is brutally kind of pragmatic. I mean, even in the conception of a commune, that sort of going out onto the community or even making your own community and that sort of spreading outwards, that even sounds like someone who's quite a cynical sort of supposedly Leninist, name of the father, son of Lacanian, like Slavoj Žižek, in his response to someone like, my God, for me saying his name out loud, Jordan Peterson, where he said, actually, no, you should don't just clean your room, go out and clean your community. And I was like, well, yes, he's reading The Coming Insurrection, clearly, old Slavoj. This feels like Geist. This isn't cynical anarcho-punk. This is absolute spirit coming down here.
Yeah, I mean, it's like whenever we talk about cynicism and realism, the most realistic thing is generally speaking to actually do something. It doesn't matter whether it's climate change or whether it's just my street being an absolute shithole. And if I could actually meet anyone around here, I would completely fix up Old Trafford. But the thing that the cynics and the people who get stuck in this moral imperative to be miserable thing don't kind of realize is that it just won't work. It's not realistic. It's not the realistic thing is being earnest and doing things, even if they kind of fail multiple times. It's as anyone who's been depressed for any amount of time will tell you, it's simply not realistic to lie in bed all day thinking about how miserable you are.
Yeah, I think that one thing that the Invisible Committee do that I think is actually extremely charging and refreshing compared to their contemporaries of like the mid 2000s, even like folks like Hart and Negri, right? With their notion of counter power, counter empire, and the multitude, like Tikkun and the Invisible Committee put the problem right in front of you and put all of your choices right in front of you too, especially the ones you made right now as you open this book, as you sit at the bus stop, right? And there's kind of a violent presence that like comes with just having this book on you, right? Or listening to some like teenager read it on YouTube or something. I do think that, when we have these discussions about the ways in which, again, what separates us may connect us, instead we choose to always make it that which separates us. It manifests in exactly what, Gareth, you're talking about, right? The way in which we deal with communal housing, or the way in which renters discuss their disposition in relation to their landlord. I think that the something worth keeping, that you found when you said that the youth subculture that throws Tikkun and TIC away in favor of reading Michael Heinrich or what have you, like some very specific, Marxist, participating in the debates about the tendency for the rate of profit to decline or whatever, is that what's left and what's valuable is this need, right? Like the likelihood that the Invisible Committee needs you, and it needs all of these individual choices that you make every single day. You don't need to submit yourself to the Invisible Committee, right? But this need is one where the ethos and fashioning of your existence must change. The decisions you make, the way you function. And I think that in some ways what I appreciate is just how open it is. And I think that's why it can reach you at different registers, whether it's rioting or defacing surveillance equipment or preventing someone from being evicted by a shitty landlord. The two different poles of intensity, I think, are helpful.
It does have as I mentioned before, it does have a certain register, a certain tone that people are going to assume it means certain things, i.e. what I said earlier, where their idea of a commune is a punk house, or it's a squat, or it's a group of homeless people with mohawks. It feels like that's what they mean. But what I wanted in the article, and what I kind of want in real life, is just, what's the boring middle-class normie way to be in a commune? How can you be in a commune if you have a job at a PR agency and have a kid, not mention anyone's name, i.e. me? Yeah, how can you? Because obviously I can't drop out and go squat anytime soon. Responsibilities. But that would be ways that I could use this idea of a commune, not being a fixed place, as in the case of Tarn at 9, but an idea that doesn't even need to call itself anything. That it could just be a bunch of people all getting together and saying, yes, we're going to, even though we're being held down and destroyed by capitalism all the time, we together will try and make stuff better for ourselves and then everyone else, because those things go very well together. I think coming out at a certain time in a certain place and with a certain tone can get misread as being just about go and be a punk, get a mohawk, get a dog who's really sick on a string that you carry around with you that's got some like the name of a famous communist, and that's gonna eventually, if enough people do that, we will have a revolution at some point in the future. But there needs to be, as with anything on the left, there needs to be a common insurrection for white middle-class suburban dudes, and there needs to be a common revolution for 70-year-olds in an old people's home, that they can bring this to their book club and they can communize the old people's home. And and there needs to be one for people in slums in the global south, and it needs to be one for all different kinds of various identity groups. You've got to be a little open-minded when you read TCI on seeing beyond just what these guys were talking about, because that was their lives. Their lives was communes and squats and punk houses. But it can be more than that. It can be virtually anything. And there are times when that whole multiplicity and the whole just usefulness of it comes through. Unfortunately, it does have that reputation of being just about anarchists and punks, when, it can be so much bigger than that.
I was just going to do a bit of a collective consciousness raising therapy here, putting out into the internet sphere. With any sort of action, any action an individual could take, or even an infinity group or a small collective can take, it's always limited by its own potencies. And the problem is that the problems that we're all responding to, and especially in terms of the internet, where as we withdraw to some extent into the internet and into culture, we are sort of more determined by the world's awfulness than we would be otherwise, because we're seeing all of it all at once, a constantly mediated and intensified flow. And this means that there's always, every problem becomes symptomatic of the actual problem, the capital P problem, which is the global problem, the systematic problem. And every action can be responded to, you're doing this while the world burns? Well, you do not have to do, everything has to be done with the aim of destroying the entire world at once in the quickest way possible. And then we should all take that burden. Not every you can do small things. That's not always going to put you in a chain of infinite causality where you have to always be following the global thing. I think this focus on the global, this universal, the aim where the universal is there first, rather than moving through universality through engaging with the particular, because we're doing good old-fashioned dialectic here. I think that's a really constraining thing. This Adorno thing, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, there's no right way to live a wrong life, and the whole is the false. But we aren't always working from the whole. We have to build up the whole by connecting with other people and our particularities and our affects and connections. And I think there's a way in which certain historical narratives and high theory perspectives that you sort of lose the fact you become this disembodied Cartesian cogito who's looking for the revolutionary subject to complete the system of German idealism and materialism and history. And it's debilitating. And I think this commune model, if it says find each other, it's like, well, I'm a theoretical mediator for this book, and I'm spewing out all of these points and these party lines. No, you go find someone, go do something, and then maybe we can work this out from then on. It doesn't. Every problem has to be a taking on of the entire world at once, and I think that's a therapeutic point which would take a lot of the burnout. While the world burns you out, rather than as the world burns.
Despite its names, communism and socialism, the left is a very individualized endeavor. We write our articles, we put them up on various websites, we start podcasts with maybe a few other people, and we aim to become the next Slavoj Žižek or someone. We aim to be an e-celeb of the left. Get people into our Twitch stream where we get to see us in our gamer chairs with all the neon around us. They just get to look at us as we talk about, and we become the big communism builder. I mean, from the very outset, the coming insurrection is not that. It's written by an anonymous, maybe collective, maybe individual, who even knows. We have a vague idea that one of them may be in the Tarnak 9, or maybe even not. No one's ever actually owned up to having written this book. These guys are not trying to get more likes and subscribes. They're just a thing called the coming insurrection. There's no individualism there. There's no aiming to be an e-celeb. There's just, I'm going to make this intervention in the world by writing something, and then you will go out you will see that you're not just a Cartesian cogito just having a bunch of words spewed into your face and then it goes into your brain and you get one step closer to becoming the big communism builder one day, having absorbed more theory with a capital T. And eventually you'll get enough theory with capital T to figure out communism. Yeah, you're not that. You should probably just some guy. You're not going to be the next Zizek or Marx or anyone, but you can, clean up your street. You can make someone else's life better. You can fix your own mental health, which is something the left really needs to do, because the Elon Musk's statement about how the left often hates itself is not entirely untrue. That could be subject of a whole series of podcasts there. But yeah, I don't think this is something I'm alone in saying. There's been a whole series of really excellent books about hope in the last few years. Tom Wyman's Infinitely Full of Hope says a lot of these same things far better than I ever could. That's an absolutely brilliant book. There's been a kind of resurgence of Ernst Bloch and his ideas of utopian thought being in just everyday practice, even in like nursery rhymes. There's a utopian little nugget in there that you can find. Even in the worst, most reactionary seeming art, there's ultimately a utopian horizon that people want to get to. So hopefully we're getting out of this space. Hopefully, there is hopefully there is a
coming insurrection.
Well, you could delete that. That is cringe. But hopefully there is a point where we get away from the whole moral imperative to be miserable and useless and to believe that place Adorno that things are so bad that you literally can't do anything, which is not just from Adorno. That's a massive, massive tendency around through all human history. It's, it's Kali Yuga in Hinduism. That the world has just gone to a point where we really can't do anything but think about how terrible this world is and construct even more intricate models of how terrible the world is. I mean, the first half of Come Insurrection is just that. It's a series of critiques and of things like Reebok sneakers and cities and UNESCO, and it's just it's a lot of negativity before it moves into actually giving you the rules for life that will hopefully move you out of these things. When I read this, I kind of skim past the first 7 or 8 circles because just don't need that. I know how bad the world is. I'm here. And then when it gets to find each other on page 97, it actually starts giving you what you need.
I can read out the 12 rules, the definitive 12 rules for life. Of course, abbreviated in the same manner as the German ideology, of course. They cut out a bit of the fat, and then I can give all our comrades the 12 rules for coming insurrection, for becoming insurrection. Insurrection's becoming. So, first rule, attach yourself to what you feel to be true and begin there. 2, do not back away from what is political in friendship. 3, expect nothing from organizations, beware of all existing social milieus, and above all, don't become one. 4, form communes. Short, simple, like it. 5, get organized in order to no longer have to work. Good. 6, plunder, cultivate, fabricate. 7, create territories, multiply zones of opacity. Don't be too easy to recognize, otherwise the police will find you. 8, travel, open up our own lines of communication. 9, remove all obstacles one by one. 10, free visibility. Kind of repetition of 7, but fair enough. Turn anonymity into an offensive position. 11, organize self-defense. And 12, make the most of every crisis. Given how things are generally quite bad, I think if not now, when? Right. All power to the communes, folks.
All power to the communes.